In this video, I'm going to show you how to convert curves into hair. Now, perhaps you've already seen the add-on that I released earlier this week for converting curves into hair. Well, the idea for that add-on came from putting this lesson together. Basically, when I'd finished recording it, I thought, do you know what, this is really long and complicated. And it would be so nice to just be able to do this with one click. And that's all this add-on initially meant to be. But once I'd figured that out, I thought, well, wouldn't it be good if we could switch between hair and curves and back again as well? And then once I got that working, I thought, wouldn't it be good if we could convert old hairstyles that we've already done into this new realistic hair system? And so this kind of went on until I ended up with the add-on, which you'll find linked in the description below, was created. And if you want to see all the features that I ended up adding to it, make sure you go and check that out. But in this video, I'm going to show you how the curve to hair nodes are set up, and probably for most of you, why the add-on is a worthy investment. So the problem with realistic style hair is that it's difficult to control. Now, a couple of years ago, they did switch from the particle hair system to geometry nodes, and with that came a bunch of new grooming tools for styling the hair. But for me, it's still a bit janky. What I'd like to be able to do is what I do for my polygon style hair, which is to create the shapes using regular curves, because this will give me much finer control over the result. So, like you, I got onto YouTube to see if I could find a solution. And what I found was a video, which I'll link below, which demonstrates how we set up geometry nodes for converting meshes into hair strands. And without that video, I would have never figured out how to do what I'm about to show you. So when we're done here, make sure you go and drop that person a like and tell them they're the go or whatever. Now, this will get a little bit complicated, but don't worry. You don't need to understand everything that's going on here to do this. So you've got your character and you're ready to add hair, or you already have hair and you just want to convert that into realistic style hair. And as I said, the nice thing about this technique is you can do that. So you can get the style you want with polygons and then convert that into realistic hair strands. To start setting this up and explaining how it works, what I'm going to do first is add in a plane. So I'm going to press Shift A. I'm going to make sure I'm in object mode. Press Shift A, Mesh, Plane. I'm just going to move that out of the way. I'm also going to scale it on X twice, so I'll do SX2 to double its length. And then I'm going to tab into edit mode. I'm going to make sure my overlays is turned on. I don't know why that's turned off. I'm also just going to hide the bones because it looks quite messy in there now. And also the light. I'm just going to right click while we're in edit mode and select subdivide, and then I'll just subdivide again. And I'll tab back into object mode. I'm going to press Ctrl A and make sure we apply all transforms. It's really important that you apply your transforms, otherwise this isn't going to work properly. Now, what we want to do, so I'll just select edge select here. What we want to do is convert these edges running down the length of our mesh. We want to convert those into hair strands. And once we've got this working on a mesh, we can then turn our attention onto curves. Now, the way we're going to tell Blender where the hair should grow from, or in other words, where the roots of our hair strands are, is by creasing the edge perpendicular to the hair strands. So it's going to be this edge right here. So with that selected, by the way, as I say, I've got my edge select. I just alt left clicked on that to select the whole of this edge here. I'm going to press N. And I'm going to come over here to item and just turn mean crease all the way to 1 like that. And you can see if I deselect that, you can see it turns it to this like purpley pinky color. And that just indicates that we now have a crease on this edge. And that's essentially all we need to do for the modeling part of it for now. So let's move on to geometry node. So I'm going to drag my cursor down to the bottom left corner here until I see this crosshair icon. Just drag up so we've got another window in here, and if I click this button here, I can change it to a geometry node editor. And then what I'm going to do is in object mode up here, I'm going to press Shift A, curve, empty hair. So we're adding an empty hair onto our plane object. And if I just twirl that down, you can see that it's right there. In fact, let's just call this hair curves. And you can see that something pops up in our geometry node editor down here. Now, I do actually just want to delete these first two nodes. We don't need those, so delete them. Now, if I select an object other than the hair curve, so if I select the plane, you can see that our geometry nodes disappear. And that's because this window here is context dependent. So no matter what you have selected, the geometry nodes attached to that object will show up here. This can get quite annoying. So what I want to do, I'll just select my hair curves here. I'm just going to press this little pin. And so now, no matter what object we select, this window is pinned to our hair object. So worth knowing. Now, the first thing I'm going to do here is our plane. I'm going to select it over here and I'm going to drag it over into our geometry node window, and you'll see that it gets added as an object info node and the plane is input into that slot there. And we get access to these attributes, and what I want to do is just plug in geometry into geometry over here. And if we hide this over here, you're going to notice something unusual, which is that it's still visible in the 3D viewport. And the reason is because this object here is now coming from our geometry nodes down here. So kind of confusing, but if I unhide this plane now, we actually have two objects on top of each other, which we don't want. So let's hide that plane. So now from here, what I'm going to do is add a capture attribute node. So capture attribute, it's quite difficult to say. I'll just drop that in the middle there. And then I'll also add a named attribute node. And I'm going to plug attribute into this slot underneath geometry here. And I also want to set the name to crease edge. So when I click that, we get a drop down list. You want to set it to crease underscore edge. So then from here, what we're going to do, I'm just going to make a little bit of space. We're going to add 4 more nodes. So we're going to add edge vertices, and we can just search for all of these. So when you press Shift A, you just press the search button and then just start typing it out and it'll come up in the list. So I'll press Shift A again. We want edge vertices. We want shortest edge paths. I'll place that underneath, and then I'll add an evaluate at index, which I will Shift D, duplicate this down here. And what I want to do is I want to plug in vertex index 1 into the first one, vertex index 2 into the second one, and then total cost from this node I will plug into the other values. Now I'll press Shift A and I will add a compare node, and where it says greater than, I'll just switch that to equal. I'll just plug the top one into A, the bottom one into B. Okay, so far so good. I'll just move our group output over here so we've got a bit more room. Now I want to plug the attribute down here into end vertex over here. And I also want to add a delete geometry node. Don't worry, we're nearly there now. And a mesh to curve node. And I want to make sure our delete geometry node is set to edge. Okay, really important. And then I will plug the result into selection, and our plane has been converted into hair strands. These are hair strands right here, which is really exciting. But there's a slight issue which isn't immediately obvious, and I'm going to demonstrate that to you now. If I add a trim curve node here, and then I trim these curves, you're going to notice they don't all go in the same direction. So while we have converted the mesh into curves, they're not all going in the right direction. So let's fix that. What I'm going to do is where we dragged our attribute from here to end vertex, if I just drag this out and go upwards, when I drop it, notice we can immediately start searching for a node. So that's a nice little shortcut to be aware of as well. And I'm going to add a multiply. And I'm also going to drag out from here and add an endpoint selection. And I will just set the end size down to 0. And then I'll drag out of this value slot and search for evaluate on domain. And then I'll drag out from here and just search for not. And we want the Boolean math not in there. Okay, we're very nearly there now, I promise. All we need to add now is a reverse curve. Plug that into there after the mesh to curve. and then drag the Boolean and plug that into selection. So now when I drag this down, you'll see that all of the hair curves are going in the same direction, which is really nice. But we don't need this trim curve, so I'm going to get rid of that. So now we have hair curves that follow the shape of our mesh. And so if we adjust this mesh, the shape of this mesh, notice that the hair curves follow it, which is really cool, really nice. Now you might notice that the hair itself, if I just hide that plane, you might notice it is quite low resolution. You know that this hair does have quite a few kinks in it. And to fix that, what we can do is come over to our render properties, make sure we're set to Eevee, and then come down to where it says curves. We can turn up this additional subdivision, and what that's going to do is subdivide those hair curves for us and make them look a bit smoother. If you grab the add-on, this is part of the UI. You don't have to dig around in the render settings or anything like that. It's all just there for you, so that's super convenient. So now we've got our geometry to hair sorted. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to move this object info node out the way. I'm also going to move the group output out the way. And I'm just going to select all this, and we're going to group it by pressing Control G. So now we've just jumped into that group, and I'm going to rename the group. So if your side panel isn't open here, just press N. It's going to bring up that side panel, and I'm going to call this Mesh to Hair Curves. So that's our group. We can tab out of the group by pressing tab, and you can see that that is now called Mesh to Hair Curves. So any geometry we plug into there that has a creased edge on one side is going to get converted into hair curves. So as I say, now we can convert meshes into hair curves, which is really powerful in of itself. A lot of hair shapes are going to be easier to create with mesh, not curves. But for a bit more control, we also want to be able to use curves, right? And specifically, the kind of hair curves that we're used to using. So these are path curves with a bevel shape. Now, the way we're going to do this, if you look at these curves, I mean, these are already being treated as though the geometry anyway, right? I mean, curves don't look like this. We can turn the wireframe on. So, you know, as far as Blender's concerned, this is already geometry anyway. So, to be able to plug it in here, all we need to do is to somehow tell Blender to crease the edge of one side of this, and then if we plug it into our node here, it should convert that into hair curves. So I'm just going to turn off the wireframe. I'm also going to come back to cycles as well here. Now, unfortunately, we can't just take a curve with a bevel like this and plug it into our geometry nodes. At least I haven't found a way to yet, and if you can, I'm all ears. Please do share. But essentially, what we need to do is remove any bevel from the curve. So if I, with my curve selected, come to my object data properties, what we need to do is remove any bevel from the curve and then rebuild it using geometry nodes. Now, it isn't a huge deal, but it does mean that if you've already got a hairstyle put together and you want to convert that into hair, you might need to go back and tweak it a little bit. It does also present another slight limitation, but I'll talk about that later. So the way we're going to remove the bevel shape from these curves here, I'm just going to hide that plane. I'm just going to select it, and then down here I'll select round and make sure there's no depth here, and you can see how this has just been converted into just a curve now. There's no geometry around it or anything. And then I'm also going to drag that into my geometry node window, and instead of having our plane plugged in here, I'll just delete that. Notice the hairs disappear. I'm going to plug the curve in there instead. Now, when we plug this into here, you might notice that we get this little warning indicator thing that says input geometry has unsupported type curve. And that's because we're plugging a curve into this and it's expecting a mesh. So why don't we, I'll just delete that node, we don't need it anymore. Why don't we add a curve to mesh node? Because that's going to convert our curve into a mesh. When we do that, notice that warning goes away. But we're not seeing anything in here yet. So what I'm going to do with my mouse over the geometry node window, I'll press Shift A, go to Curve, Primitives, and add in a curve circle. Now when we plug this into here, and nothing happens, and that's because we're still plugged into this, which we don't want to be. So rather than go through the hassle of taking this out and plugging it over here, we can actually bypass a node temporarily by selecting it and just pressing M. And you can see something has happened in the 3D viewport. Probably not what you're expecting, but I'm going to explain that now. The reason this has happened, well, there's two reasons why it looks so crazy. First of all, I haven't applied transforms on this curve, which is why it's in completely the wrong place. So let's take care of that first. I'll press Ctrl A and apply transforms. It is following the curve, but it looks a little bit crazy. And the reason is our radius is too high up here. So if I just turn the radius down here, you can see we're getting much closer to the result we are expecting. Now, you can still adjust these curves points individually. So if I just tab into edit mode, I can use my Alt S to make individual points thicker as well. So that is really handy to know too. Okay, so now that that's working, our next job is to crease one end of the curve so that this node is going to work. Now, to do that, I'm going to add a few more nodes. So I'm going to add in a capture attribute node again. So I'm going to press Shift A, start typing capture attribute. I'm just going to drop that in between our curve and our curve to mesh node like this. And then I'm going to search for endpoint selection. And I'm going to turn the start size down to 0 and plug that into here. And now after the curve to mesh, I'm going to add a store named attribute. Just drop that in there. And where it says name here, I'm going to type in crease underscore edge. Make sure you spell that right. That's quite important. And then where we have our selection here, I'm just going to drag that over to value, not selection, to value. So now if we unmute this, you can see we have our curve that's now converted into hair curves. How cool is that? And we can also adjust the resolution down here. So if I tweak this, we're adjusting our resolution. So if I just mute this node again and I turn on wireframe, you can see what's happening here. Turning the resolution up increases the resolution of our bevel object on our curve. And remember, it's these edges traveling down the length of the hair that's getting converted into hair curves. So turning up the resolution here turns up the number of hair curves flowing down here. Now, you don't actually want to turn this up really high because we are going to use modifiers that will add more hair strands to these guide hairs in a bit more natural way as well. But before we move on to that, we do actually have a bit of an issue which isn't immediately obvious. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to press Shift A. I'm going to add in a new path curve. Move it across, apply transforms, and I'm actually going to drag this in here and plug that in there. And the issue that I'm referring to is the fact that while it is being converted into hair strands, it doesn't actually match the length of the curve. So this is quite easy to fix. All we want to do is add a resample curve node and drop that in between our curve and the capture attribute. And notice that does work there, but we do want to change this to be evaluated. And that is essentially it. We're not quite there yet, but we do have our hair strands following our hair curve. Now, our job now is to try and make this look a little bit more realistic. But we do actually have another small issue before we move on to doing that, which is if I were to duplicate this curve doesn't have hair on it. And that's because we are only adding it to this one specific curve that we've dragged into our geometry node editor. So the way around this is instead of converting an individual curve, we can convert a whole collection of curves. So if I add a new collection, and I call this hair curves, and I grab all of these curves that we have that make up our hair here, drop it into the hair curves collection. Now what I can do is drag this into here, and if I plug this straight in, you can see we do get something. Do you know what I've forgotten to do? I haven't yet removed the bevel off all of these hair strands. So let's do that now. I'll select the bottom one, shift select the rest. And because this one already has the bevel removed, I can just right click on where it says round and do copy to selected. And then, well, there's no depth on any of these curves, but if there was, you could also do a copy to selected on that as well. But now you can see it does kind of look like it's working, but it's not quite right. And the reason is we need to add one more node, and that is a realize instances. And we drop that in after the collection before the resample. And now these are all hair curves. And one thing I did mean to do earlier that I forgot to do, if we come back to our render settings and change it to Eevee, we want to change it to strip. And that just gives you slightly better results in the viewport while you're working with the hair here. And again, these options are available directly in the UI of the hair add-on, so that's convenient. So now that we've got our hair curves following our regular curves, our job now is to try and make this look a little bit more realistic. And to be honest, this next section is probably a full course in of itself, and I wouldn't call myself an expert in it just now either. I've still got a bit more research to do this myself, but I feel like I can point you in the right direction at least. And the way we're going to make this look a bit more realistic is by using modifiers. Now, before I do that, I'm just going to turn the resolution right down on these curves. We don't need it to be so high because we're going to be duplicating these hair curves, as I say, using modifiers. So if I select my hair curves, come over to the modifiers panel, what we can do and what you might be aware of is if I click this add modifier button, we've got a section here for hair, and these are all modifiers for affecting the look of the hair we have over here. And what I want to add, if I go to generation, I'll add a duplicate hair curves node. Now you are going to want to play around with these settings, but you can see what it's done. It's added a bunch of hair curves around the ones that we already had in our scene. And we can turn this up. You're probably going to want to check even thickness. I find that makes it look a lot better in my experience. And we can change the radius as well, so how far around our guide hair curves are those duplicates being generated. We will want more than this, but I don't want my scene to get too heavy, so I'll just leave that at around 30, and I will also just turn off wireframe while we're here. Now, as well as being able to add the modifiers down here, what I want to show you is we can also add them in our geometry node window here as well. So if I just remove that one and I press Shift A, you'll notice down here we have a section called hair, and that has all the same modifiers that we have over here, except you can just drop them in right inside your geometry node editor, and we can just drop it in line. Then you can see it does exactly the same thing, and we have all the same options that we had in our modifier over there. So change that to 30, set it to even thickness, and it's doing exactly the same job, except it's all in the same place down here. Oh, we can get rid of those now, we don't need them. So I find this a little bit cleaner personally, but if you're used to using modifiers, because we've been using modifiers in Blender for years, you might prefer to just use them over here. I like to keep them in the node editor. It's your choice. As I say, if you pick up the add-on, you'll have them all in the UI down here. So it's up to you. Okay, so as well as duplicate hair, I'm also going to add a clump. So I'll go to hair, guide, clump hair curves, and I'll just drop that in there. What that does is clump them towards the tips, which looks really nice, and you can tweak the settings so that it's not so aggressive. We can adjust the shape here like that, adjust it however you want. And also what I'm going to add is a trim hair curves. So if I go to hair deformation, we want the trim hair curves at the bottom. I'll just drop that in there, and I will uncheck replace length. And then where we have random here, I'm going to turn that up, and what that's going to do is randomize how long each hair strand is, and it just looks a bit more natural if, you know, they're not all ending at the same point. So play around with that one as well. And it's looking as though these hair strands might be a little bit thick. They might not be as well, but we can adjust how those look too. So I'll press Shift A, hair, and go to right and set hair curve profile. And in here, we can adjust the radius of each strand. So if I turn this up to 0.05, this should get really thick. So something to mention is that actually this only affects how it looks in cycles. So if I go to rendered, you'll see these hair curves are looking really thick now. I'll just render that area. Whereas if I set this to 0.005, the hair strands go much thinner. So another setting to play around with. I'll just get rid of that. So now we have something that looks slightly more like her. I mean, we do have a lot more work to do, but as I say, I'm just kind of pointing you in the right direction so that you can play around with all these settings for yourself. But now we do need to add a material to this, and we can do that right here in the geometry node editor again. So I'll press Shift A, and what I'm going to search for is set material. And we're just going to drop that in there. Now at the minute, we don't have a material in here, so there is no material applied. But what we can do is add a new material, and we'll call this hair underscore material, like that. And then we can set it in here. So if I just search for hair material. So now, let me just create another window. We'll set that to be a shader editor. This is our hair material. And at the minute, it's set to principled BSDF. But what we want is a principled hair BSDF. And we are going to run into an issue here. So if I plug this in, you can see that it all turns black. And that's because in Eevee, which it's being rendered with now, this principled hair BSDF doesn't work. So what I tend to do is I tend to set the material output here to cycles. I'll duplicate this using Shift D, and I'll set this to be Eevee, and I'll plug principled BSDF into Eevee, and then principled hair BSDF into cycles. And what we can do from here is if I add an RGB node, plug this into the color here and the base color here, we can set the color of our hair right here. So let's say we want it this pinkish color, and so it's pink in Eevee, but if we switch to cycles, you can see that it's also pink over there too. It's not perfect, you know, the color that we're seeing here isn't exactly the same as the one that we're seeing here, but it's a lot better than going with this look that we had earlier, like this. Oh, I just noticed that if we put color in there, it actually gives us a color in Eevee. That's interesting. I didn't know that happened. I'd have to look more into that. However, I would recommend just sticking with this setup for now, because that might not give you the result you're after. But, you know, have a play around with that. I can't imagine that changing any of these settings will do anything. It doesn't look like they do. Okay. Whereas if we change these settings, that does affect what we see in the viewport. But yeah, as I said, that's probably a lesson for another day. So modifiers and materials, they're probably big topics in of themselves. So I will leave that there. So I hope you learned something from this video. I know it's quite complicated, but don't forget the Hair Wrangler add-on does all of this for you, plus a whole lot more. And I have a bunch of exciting updates coming soon for it as well. So make sure you check that out. Until then, have fun creating hair. And make sure you tag me in the results on social media. I genuinely love to see it.